Hi everyone, my name is Alan Davis, founder of MediatorAcademy.com, home of the passionate mediator. If you're a conflict resolution practitioner and want to develop your thinking, learn brand new skills, even sharpen old ones, then this is the place for you. We track down thought leaders and experienced practitioners from around the world, and for 60 minutes, try and get answers to some pretty important questions so that you can improve your effectiveness, develop your thinking, and sharpen your skills. All right, the big theme of today's interview is conflict. What is conflict? What are the causes of conflict? How do cultural differences cause conflict? What are the stages of conflict? You know, whilst I think I intuitively know all of this stuff, I don't think I've ever stopped to give it a thought. You know, I just take these things for granted. But I've no doubt that my guest today has given it plenty of thought. He began his working life as a political analyst, specialising in East-West relations and arms control. In 1985, while working on the staff of the then Archbishop of Canterbury, he acted as assistant to the Archbishop's envoy, Waite, during a mission to negotiate the release of British hostages in Libya. He subsequently worked for a Swiss intermediary organisation in South Africa. In 1990, his first book, A Sudden Outbreak of Common Sense, Managing Conflict Through Mediation, was published while he was ADR Group's first Director of Mediation. Following a semester as a visiting professor at the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University, he began his freelance career working nationally and internationally with businesses, governments, non-governmental and civil society organisations to design and facilitate dialogue on many controversial issues such as the transport of nuclear waste, decommissioning of offshore installations, industrial development in environmentally sensitive areas, climate change, corporate social responsibility, and many, many other things. Today, he specialises in designing and facilitating stakeholder dialogue and consultation processes in complex, multi-party, multi-issue contexts, often with environmental and social sustainability dimensions. He's the founder of Dialogue by Design and is also a dialogue and engagement specialist for ScienceWise. It's a real pleasure to welcome Andrew Acland onto Mediator Academy. Andrew, a warm welcome.
Thank you, Alan. Very good to be here.
Wow, what a CV, what a story.
Well, yes, all by accident, of course. No one ever plans a career like this, I don't think.
I interviewed Bill Marsh a while ago, and the title of the interview was something like 007 of Mediators. But I think I'm going to take that title away from Bill Marsh, and you've got that title now.
No, I would not remotely take that from Bill. It's entirely appropriate for him. I think it's very good. I will tease him about it next time I see him.
All right. So, I want to find out a bit more about the work that you currently do as a stakeholder dialogue process designer. I want to know a bit more about what exactly it is, what does it look like, and so on. I also want to get into the nitty-gritty of conflict. But, before we even get there, tell me a little bit about your experience as a working on the staff of Terry Waite, accompanying him on all his missions and getting involved in the release of hostages. That is just mind-boggling. How do you get into that, and what's it like?
Well, again, by accident. I was the Archbishop's. This is 30 years ago, Alex. So forgive me if some of the details escape me. I was on the Archbishop's staff, doing classical staff work, answering correspondence, preparing speeches and lectures, all that sort of stuff. And in the middle of this, Terry sort of developed this role as going off to try and deal with these problems around the world. And Libya got complicated, so I got a call one evening saying, could I be on the next plane to I can't remember even where it was now, Tripoli, I think. And so we spent an interesting couple of days trying to deal with this problem. But it was all rather, it was very much on the spur of the moment, and I had no idea that it would finally sort of clinch my career for me.
And at the time, do you remember? Was it sort of a? Was it one of those experiences that just it feels like you're traveling at 100 miles an hour in a wind tunnel or whatever? Or did you have time to pause and think about what you were getting into? And then were you able to draw upon some of your knowledge, theories, and apply them? Or was it just seat of the pants stuff?
I would say that it was absolutely seat of the pants stuff. Yes, that was about it. I had no idea what I was getting into. And for the time it lasted, which was only a few days, it was very much seat of the pants. Yeah.
Wonderful.
And slightly nerve-wracking at moments, I have to say.
I can imagine.
For a long, long time. Yeah.
So fast forward now 30 years, and you're now, getting involved in some fairly substantial processes, stakeholder facilitation processes. Tell us a little bit more about the dialogue design process. What exactly is it? What does it look like?
What does it look like? Well, imagine that you have somewhere between, say, 20 and 100 people who need to have quite a complicated conversation about a complicated subject. So let's take one of the examples you gave, like the transport of nuclear waste or development in a sensitive area. You have anything up to 20 or 30 different parties, ranging from government working within certain statutory requirements, to commercial organizations who may have an interest in development, for example, to local pressure groups who may be looking to safeguard their community's interests, to international pressure groups who are working on upholding certain principles and standards, concerned about justice and equity and things like that. And you have all these people, and you know that the object is to try to bring them to at least a mutual understanding of where they are coming from and what they're trying to achieve. I mean, unlike probably a lot of sort of legal and commercial mediation, there isn't a deal as such to be done. There is the improvement of understanding, perhaps the hammering out of certain protocols or certain things which people will do or won't do. And the question is actually, how do you have a conversation with 100 people? How do you get into the subject? How do you get everybody talking about the same issues at the same time? How do you make sure people who are maybe less inclined to speak, maybe inhibited in some way because of their education or their background, still have a chance to put their point of view? How do you prevent the heavy hitters from dominating the conversation? So what combination of small group, large group work actually gets you to the point where people are really talking to each other and are really beginning to find ways forward in this situation? And process design is simply the case of working out about 100 ways how not to do it and trying to plump for the one which might work.
I mean, it sounds incredibly complex. If I was to take just a typical mediation, I give a lot more thought to the process today than I would, 3 or 4 years ago. But still, it sounds like the success or failure of your intervention, of the meeting, really comes down to how well you design the process. Is that right? Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I think it does, actually. And I think the reason why, compared with, say, doing a 2 or 3 party mediation, it is more complicated simply because you've got many more people, many more points of view, and very often quite a constrained time frame. So you have to use the time as effectively as you can to get over wherever you're going to. So process design is absolutely crucial. But one of the great ironies of it is that normally, in going through a meeting of that sort, whether it's for a day or sort of 3 days, you probably go through anything up to about a dozen drafts of this process.
Yeah.
And then you discover about 20 minutes in that you've made a complete horlicks and you've got completely the wrong point of view. But at least having done your dozen drafts, you've already thought about how else you might be able to do it. So that if you actually have to switch track very quickly, then at least you have kind of thought about it very thoroughly.
So flexibility and being, you know,
Absolutely.
If you're the kind of person that is inflexible, this is not for you.
Now, there's nothing worse than trying to hammer on with a process which everybody in the room is saying, no, this is not working.
Yeah.
And also, you have to remember all the time, of course, that it is your participants' meeting. You are just there to help them. And if they really don't want to do what you've spent hours designing, then you have to change track.
Yes.
Yeah.
Gosh.
And you have to respect that all the way through, of course.
Yeah. And well, I want to come to in a moment the kinds of what you've learned by doing this kind of work, because I mean you touched on a couple of things where you've got very powerful or dominant not just personalities but stakeholders that have, you know, positional power or resource power. You know, how you manage those dynamics in a very complex dialogue process. I'm also curious, you know, if you've got such a wide range of stakeholder groups, you're going to have a broad spectrum of it's going to be rich in culture, for example, not just sort of social classes but all sorts of different cultural aspects. I'm curious to know how those elements contribute, you know, productively or less productively to the dialogue, and how they contribute to creating the conflict.
Yeah, I suppose the basis of that is that the more cultural difference you have, and not simply between sort of ethnicities or religions or faith or whatever, but the cultural difference between a small organization and a large organization, between a government department and a pressure group, or between a large commercial business and a local community group. Those are also cultural differences. And people make assumptions about that everybody else works the way that they do. And the only way to get past this really is to slow down and to make sure that when people say things, that it is heard by others in the way in which it is intended. And if you think there is something which is arising from a cultural difference, you slow down and you explore it, and you make sure that there is a real understanding of what people are really saying, and understanding by what is said. It just adds to the fun, really.
I bet it does. I mean, could you give an example of where you've been facilitating a conversation between a number, and it's sort of struck you in the moment that it appears to be a cultural a void between these two groups, and you've intervened to kind of slow the conversation down?
Well, actually, one of the most interesting examples of dealing with a cultural difference, this is probably a bit out on the wing because it really was fascinating and probably not typical, but quite a few years ago, I was working with a team, and we were working on a potential pipeline development in quite a remote part of Peru. There was an oil company wanted to build a pipeline through a jungle, which was where the local communities really had very little experience of, certainly of white people, but certainly of white business people arriving in helicopters with chunks of pipeline. And also very unfamiliar with the very, very heavily sort of language-based, word-based types of conversation that people were used to. And luckily, we all tumble to this quite soon. And we realized that actually the best way for people to have a conversation was by using visual images. So we managed to find a way of putting up vast sheets of paper, and we asked local communities to actually draw a picture of their life as it was, and to set out things in relation to each other, which actually helped them to explain about their lives and what was of concern to them and where their interests lay, and also helped everybody else in the room, which was pressure groups, government, business, to understand the picture from their point of view. But it was great because they were able to explain it visually in a way in which they could not have done if they were just sort of standing up and trying to make speeches about it.
That's fascinating, isn't it?
So that is a way of using cultural difference actually as a way of enriching the conversation.
That's a beautiful example, a real creative sort of...
Well, at its best, I think this kind of dialogue process really does have to be creative.
Yeah. You
really do have to actually think creatively about it. What is really going to help people talk to each other?
And how do you contract in with the... I'm going slightly off. How do you contract in with the parties, leading up to a meeting like this? Is there a process of contracting?
Yes, that as I remember it, on that occasion, we were working for a small NGO, which actually was specialising in doing this sort of dialogue work. So they had been approached, as I remember it, by the development company, and then took it upon themselves to make the right contacts out in the field and to make sure. And half the art of this is actually getting the right people in the room.
Yeah.
So you do what is usually called a stakeholder analysis, and you work out actually who needs to be in the room in order for the conversation to be regarded as legitimate and valid and to cover all bases.
Sure.
So it's an essential part of the preparation for this kind of work.
Yeah.
And you do start, quite a few months in advance with this sort of project.
Yeah. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. So, I want to kind of strip it back down to the basics. I was thinking about this interview, and I don't think I've really thought about what causes conflict, what conflict is. I think I've learned some of the theory, but when I go into a mediation or when I'm engaging with parties, I tend to just be more... I'm justifying it now. I think I'm being more present and dealing what's in front of me.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether that's, there must be something that's good about that, but I'm slightly mindful about being a bit thin on the ground when it comes to my theory of conflict. So I want to spend a little bit of time getting your thoughts on, what is conflict, Andrew?
What is conflict?
Let's start
That's
there.
Quite a big question. For me, it is, and I think this comes back to, in a way, sort of where we are with this field as a whole. If you take the sort of conflict resolution, conflict transformation field, which runs everywhere from putting a mediation clause in a commercial contract or putting a anti-bullying policy into a school, right up to kind of armed intervention by the United Nations, the underlying critical thing is actually human difference. For me, the vision of this field is that human beings over the last couple of thousand years have got pretty good at good things. Many things we can put, space probes onto comets and men on the moon. We can, possibly find cures for cancer and all the rest of it. But the one thing we have been very bad at is actually dealing with human difference. And you see it now, what is happening in this hideous tragedy across the Middle East. People of different cultures and different beliefs, different power structures, different agendas. tearing each other's lives apart. This has got to be the great challenge for the 21st century, is human beings dealing better with the fact of being different from each other. We are not good at that yet. So that's one which I think is underlined to me every time I do something. And when you are designing a process, I think you have to think about with how are these people different? What do they need to understand about each other in order simply to be able to accommodate their differences or to overcome them, to transcend their differences?
Yeah.
If you like, that is, for me, this is the vision for the field, is dealing with human difference. But talking about sort of causes of conflict, one which has actually really interested me increasingly over the years is the role which uncertainty plays in difference.
Go on.
And for me, uncertainty is one of those things which sort of always lurks beneath the surface. And when I mean uncertainty about information, about data. What is really going on? What are the facts? And then uncertainty about other people's intentions. What are other people really wanting to do? Where are they trying to get to? And then uncertainty about what else could happen, what else could intervene to change the situation as it is. So you have those forms of uncertainty, and wherever you have human uncertainty, the human tendency is to get anxious about it, to get anxious, to get fearful.
Yeah.
And when you have that, you tend to trigger the sort of fight or flight reaction. People either disengage because they don't want to have to deal with the uncertainty because they're anxious about it, or they tend to fight back, and they tend to fight others to try and establish that their certainty is the one which should reign supreme. So where you have uncertainty, you first have fear and anxiety, and then you have hostility, because people try and deal with the uncertainty by actually forcing their will upon others. And of course, then where you have hostility, you have conflict. And where you have conflict, you have more uncertainty because nobody knows what's going to happen. And this kind of cycle is so common and in all sorts of circumstances. So the data might be, obscure data about climate change or not. But equally, it might be about sort of in the local neighborhood is what is going to happen when the new road comes in? What is going to happen to the traffic outside my door? And this kind of uncertainty does create real problems. The only plus side of uncertainty is that it's something that everybody has in common. So sometimes when you have people who are very polarized around something, if you can start by working to reduce the uncertainty for everybody, then you kind of start building up some kind of common ground for them.
Yeah.
The reduction of uncertainty becomes a kind of common quest.
And it's interesting. I've really enjoyed that description, actually, because if I think about uncertainty, I interviewed Gerald Monk very recently. Gerald Monk is co-founder of Narrative Mediation, and he talks about sort of enriching the narrative, broadening it out, and I see the process of developing the narrative and broadening parties' narratives as creating a bit more data and a bit more certainty. It's as if our job is helping parties reduce uncertainty, reduce anxiety, so that because when you're anxious, you can't use these, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. First thing that goes. Yeah.
So so part of our job as a mediator or a conflict resolution practitioner, whatever we want to call ourselves, it is to reduce uncertainty, reduce anxiety. It sounds to me that's almost like a helpful frame to work through with parties. Tell me, do you in the work that you do, Andrew, do you talk about conflict with parties? Do you help them understand what's going on?
Oh yes, I think so. I think that is it's. I think getting people to understand and acknowledge the situation they're in is very helpful, because it's very often something which, conflict is, I think, a bit of a taboo. People don't like acknowledging the fact that they are in conflict. Um, and one of the things, because of that, I would say when I'm training mediators or facilitators, that one of your first obligations is to create a safe space, to create safety for people so that they can talk about the things which are troubling them, and feel safe while doing so. And that really is terribly important in some situations. You build confidence in people that they are somewhere where they can acknowledge things which they might otherwise prefer not to.
Yeah, so that, I mean, that's it's a bit like the is it the, I can't remember. Is it the Hippocratic Oath from?
Yeah, thou shalt do no harm.
Yes,
If only, yeah.
in a sense, thou shalt create a safe enough space for you to say what you need to say.
Yeah, you have to build that confidence, and some of that. We go back to process design here. When there is very little confidence among the parties, you have to think about what we sometimes call the often talk about the visible products and the invisible products. The visible products of a dialogue process is people come to, they may arrive with a piece of paper or a set of protocols or a set of agreements to meet again and to have certain conversations. But the invisible products are also very important. Things like trust and confidence and mutual understanding. So very often, if you've got people who are in a very polarized situation, you invest time to give people a chance to really understand each other better. And having done that, you can then begin to talk about more complicated things.
Yeah.
In a sense, it's a process of actually very often kind of teaching people to talk to people who they've never talked to before, and never have, maybe even types of people they have no experience with before.
I mean, it is striking how bad we are as a race at sort of handling conflict. Really, I interviewed Bernie Mayer recently, and he talks about, he's got these different paradoxes, right? And he was saying that one of the reasons we've been so successful as a species is because we've been able to collaborate or cooperate well, and learning how to cooperate with each other enables us to be more competitive as a species.
Yes, absolutely. One of the sort of bits of work I do at the moment, I do some work for something called the Partnership Brokers Association, which I think is a fascinating initiative, which has been going on for about a dozen years or so. And it sprang out of the Prince of Wales's Business Leaders Initiatives. And the idea is to train third-party partnership brokers using skills which you would, from very easily recognizable from mediation, huge overlaps. And these people go out into obscure bits of Africa or Siberia or the Canadian Arctic or something, and they bring together businesses and local government and community groups, and they mediate effectively partnerships between these very diverse organizations in order to do things like bringing healthcare or educational initiative. And this is sort of systematic collaboration. How do you get a massive multinational corporation working with a very small community group composed of indigenous people? It's not straightforward. Yeah. They have different assumptions about how things work.
Yeah.
It is an example of just how broad I think this field is getting. And it's a shame in many ways that these kind of proactive applications of third-party skills, mediation skills, are not more widely known about, actually. I think sometimes we do very easily sort of slip into silos in this field, and you're either you're a family mediator, or you're a legal mediator, or something, doing something else, and we don't actually talk to each other enough and learn enough about the whole range of work being done across this field.
Oh, there's a huge absence of I think we need a body of theory, a real thick. Not just a thick
it is out there. It's out there, but it is quite disparate.
It's all over the place.
Virtually, yeah, it's all over the place. But so many universities now have courses or departments on peace or conflict or negotiation or mediation or whatever. There's a massive amount going on out there. One of the saddest, I think, in the United States has always been quite lucky. They've had organizations which have brought together, like the Association for Conflict Resolution, people from different parts of the spectrum to talk to each other. And we've never been terribly good at doing that in this country, actually.
Yeah,
probably because enough of us.
I mean, it is interesting, if so Bernie Mayer is saying cooperation and competition are not opposite ends of the spectrum. We need to be good at both, and and if we take that kind of thinking into the field of mediation, if we were better at cooperating as a field, we might be able to not just compete with other traditional adversarial dispute resolution processes, but mediation could become a real mainstream approach, the default for people, not just process-wise, but actually culturally. I grew up in the Rhondda Valleys, and during the miners' strikes, and the idea that if you could talk about a difficulty you had with someone was nonsense. You sorted it out in one of two ways, and it didn't involve talking.
I did so agree with that. But with one difference, though. You see, I think that mediation always needs to have an education element in it. In a way, the job of mediators, facilitators should actually be always make themselves redundant, to make the people they're working with so much better at talking to each other that they no longer need the third party. That would be really the way forward, to make ourselves redundant. Probably not a very popular point of view. But actually,
what I said? I said earlier, I don't edit the videos. I might just edit that bit out.
No, don't think about it. One of your jobs in what we do is actually to teach people how to deal with difference. We said before, one of the causes of difference is actually to make sure that people learn the habits of process, the habits of dialogue and conversation, which actually make them better able to deal with the difference. And I tell you what, while we're on the subject of difference, another great cause of conflict, which I think in the 21st century is even more relevant, is the relationship between conflict and change. And in a way, you can see all conflict as being about change, the cost of change, the pace of change, who has to change what, who pays for the cost of change, in what currency. That is a huge relationship which people need to understand, I think.
Yes. So if we look at conflict then, from I'm just trying to understand conflict now. So dealing with human difference, dealing with uncertainty, dealing with change. What are the stages of a conflict, from where it's a sort of something innocuous to I can't sit in the same room as this individual, otherwise I want to launch myself across the table and strangle them. What happens in between? What are the stages? Can we define those stages?
Well, I think the first thing I would have to say is, because I'm getting a sort of echo on the line. Is that all right from your point?
Yeah, there's been a little bit of interference, but it's
Okay.
is it still okay? Is it okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
All right.
Fine. You suddenly coming at this end, I can hear it coming back, but I will ignore it.
Okay.
I just hope it doesn't screw up the recording for you.
Should be okay.
Okay. The first thing I think to say is that you have to take a designer approach to conflict and to intervening in conflict. You can, I think, identify stages which appear, but you have to start with the idea that every single instance of conflict is different from every other. And that is because the people driving it are different. There is a real problem in this field with blanket rules, either of analysis or of intervention. Every conflict is a designer conflict. And, for some people, it might start with an untoward tweet or conversation or something completely out of the blue. For others, it'll start much more slowly and it will build up over a period of time. So it's difficult to be, I think, hard and fast. You recognize it when you see it. And I think the trick is actually for people is to understand and almost to sort of sharpen their intuition as to when things are not quite right. Rather, as in a mediation, you get the feeling that you're missing something. And it's that same thing. It's the sort of pricking on the back of the neck which you pay attention to, which tells you more about conflict, I think, sometimes than any kind of regular analysis of the stages it goes through. Always different, every single one.
Yeah, that is true. That is true. I was thinking actually whether one could reverse engineer the conflict, and that being almost a process. If you're thinking parties arrive, with the stuff that they bring, and whether there was a way of reverse engineering through a dialogue to help them unravel what the journey that they've been on that's led them to this point, and along that reverse engineering path, they improve their understanding about how they got themselves into the position and how they might have avoided this impasse or wherever they've reached.
That's a really interesting thought. I hadn't thought of it as a form of reverse engineering, but you're right, of course. And when at the early stage of a mediation, you give people a chance to vent a bit and to have a bit of a shout. Actually, that in effect is what you are doing. You are getting people to tell their stories, and I'm a huge favour of people, telling their stories, how it is from their point of view. I think that's an essential part of any form of dialogue process, so that others can understand how things felt and were perceived from their point of view. And I think one of the tensions you often find in any form of dialogue is how much time you spend on the past and how much time you spend on the future. It is useful to visit the past, to understand how things got to where they are. But there is always the danger of getting locked into it and getting so deep that you kind of lose all hope of ever getting out of it. So it's a fine balance between past and future, I think, very often. You need to do the past stuff. You need people to understand what has gone wrong, to acknowledge where they could have done things differently, perhaps. But equally, you don't want people wallowing in all the baggage.
Yeah, no, it is a fine. It's almost the past is where the learning can take. Where they can learn about how they've ended up where they've ended up and what they could have done differently and how they might have contributed unwittingly to the conflict being worse than it needed to. And then the future is about problem solving, is about finding a way forward, an agreement, not necessarily agreement, but how they're going to make better choices and better decisions from this sort of junction.
Yeah, what they need to do differently in the future. Yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, I was just thinking, the concept of reverse engineering just came to me now. So this isn't something that, which is one of the things that I really like about these conversations, Andrew. This is where ideas, and I'm sure it's because I'm speaking to somebody who is creative and is, spontaneous, and I'm sure there is some secret sauce coming through the.
Oh, come on! I'm sketching out the course already.
But
reverse engineering in dispute resolution.
But but if you're thinking about, explaining to somebody what a mediator does, part of it is reverse engineering your conflict so that you can see how you got into the mess in the first place, so you don't do it again. But also the other part is helping you build, engineer a future that really works for you.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, and I think actually being able to explain it in one of the things I slightly worry about in the sort of legal and commercial mediation is the gradual infiltration of sort of legal or quasi-legal or quasi-judicial terms, which given the original idea of mediation was to try and sort of slightly get away from that. I do worry that some of the language creeping in is beginning to look a bit formal and a bit too unlike what ADR as the alternative was always supposed to be. Yeah. So there's a bit of a warning in this, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Plain language. Yeah.
And so I want to understand as well what you've taken from your training and learning in mediation to the work that you do now. Are there any bits that you've learned that you've kind of left behind, or hasn't worked for you in the kind of work that you do now? What have you adapted?
Oh wow.
I put you on the spot a bit.
You have, no, that's right. Nothing really springs to mind, because I think that one of the things you need to do as a mediator is to bring all of your experience together to the table. And in a sense, I mentioned just now the importance of your sort of intuition telling you when things are not quite right. I don't, this is not a magical sixth sense. The intuition actually comes from, the unconscious processing of a lot of experience. And in a sense, I think whenever you come in to do something, you are actually bringing the totality of what you've done in the past to it. And that's the only way to do it, actually.
Yeah. So what principles of conflict resolution, or what principles of mediation do you draw upon that informs the way you work today?
For me, I think the most important thing is, in many ways, to respect the integrity of the parties you're dealing with. That you may find, what they are doing, what they think, very different from how you might approach it or how others might approach it. But you have to respect that that is their point of view to which they are entitled, and you work with it. So there's that. I think obviously the principles of independence, impartiality. I don't like the term neutrality, which it does get used, because actually human beings are never neutral. There's always stuff going on, if you're aware of it or not. But to actually...
I want to step in for a moment.
Yeah.
When I asked you the question, you talked about respecting the integrity of the parties, right? And the way you said that, I really got a sense that was important. When you said, then you said something like, and then there's the independence and the impartiality. What do you think about that? I mean, it was almost like, what do they call it? Cognitive dissonance.
It's because it's a given. It's a given. Okay. You can't do this work if you are going to be... One of the first things I think I do say when I'm training people is that you have to understand the difference between process and content. particularly if you are a facilitator, particularly in a very political situation. And this is why, the independence and the impartiality is such a given. In the legal and commercial world, there's been this, for a long time, this sort of debate about the difference between facilitative and evaluative mediation, for example.
Yeah.
Boy, in my world, if you're evaluative, you're shown the door very quickly. The twitch of an eyebrow at the wrong moment, and you're out on your ear.
Is that right?
You really, really do have to be detached. You advise on the process, but you do not ever express an opinion on the content.
Yeah. So you might have an opinion, but you've got to keep that under wraps.
Well, I always quote, I think it was Clement Attlee, who was described by one of his opponents, sat on the fence for so long that the iron had entered into his soul. I identify with that, really. I don't have opinions about anything, and if I do, I don't do the work, actually.
Okay, all right. So if you're asked to do a piece of work and you feel strongly either way about it, and you're worried that might interfere with your effectiveness, then you
absolutely
step away.
Yeah.
Gosh.
No, you have to. It really in anything which is remotely sort of political. Any facilitator who actually is voices any kind or gives an indication of an opinion immediately loses credibility and trust with the people they're working with. You just can't do it.
Yeah, I can see that. Okay. Where's the future of mediation, Andrew? Conflict resolution. What as practitioners, what do we need to be doing, learning, thinking about?
Wow, another big question. Okay. Firstly, I think people need to have a sense of, as I said before, the breadth of the field. That there is a danger in being caught in silos and not learning from what people are doing in other parts of the field.
Yeah.
So that's important. Secondly, there is the wider education bit I also mentioned before, that the big job we have really in front of us is actually teaching human beings how to deal with difference and conflict. That is as much a role for mediators as is dealing with the disputes immediately in front of us. And for that reason, I would like to see the profession having a much higher profile. I'd like to see pieces in serious newspapers addressing from a third-party point of view situations of conflict which emerge all the time. Now, of course, not everything can be mediated. We do have to be realistic about this. There are groups, there are situations where actually our approach is just not going to work. But there are many others where it does need to. Yeah. It can be applied. We need to bring ideas like the management of uncertainty into much broader common consciousness, I think.
Yeah.
There's one of the things that I often find at the end of any training course, people say that the value of this is, I'm going to apply it in my professional life, but golly, it appears to negotiating with my children, it works for negotiating with my children or my partner or the parish council or whatever as well. Absolutely, yes, this stuff is actually about being a decent human being as well as actually dealing with disputes. So those are my three things. Firstly, to understand the field itself, a much better mutual understanding, familiarity with it. Secondly, the educational role, and thirdly, the broadening, publicizing of the role.
Yeah, interesting. Now, you do you train mediators and facilitators, is that right?
Increasingly less, actually. Right. Most of my facilitators more, because that's where the bulk of my work has been for the last 20 years or so. But I'm beginning to do less of that as time on. There's a danger for being any trainer is that you start boring yourself, and then it means you start boring other people as well.
And in the work in the training that you did or do you talk about the dealing with human difference? Do you talk about handling uncertainty, dealing with uncertainty, and reducing anxiety? Does that come into your...
Fundamentally.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, yes.
And how much of... Well, I guess, if we come back to the beginning of the interview when you talked about, the design of the process, is probably the big... Getting that right is the big chunk of work for some of the examples that you gave. How important is understanding human difference, understanding uncertainty and anxiety in the process design?
Fundamental, again. Every situation is different. And before you can do the process design, you have to understand both the situation on which you're working and the parties, the people who are coming to it.
Yeah.
So, this is why processes like stakeholder analysis, issues analysis, uncertainty analysis is the first thing that you do. You then go to the far end and try and think about, where realistically, in the time available, where can we actually get to in terms of moving everybody onwards? And then you go back and you work out how to get people from where they are to where they could realistically get to. And that is the process design. How do we do it?
Yeah.
How do we bring together these people in such a way that they get to understand each other better, they work on particular issues, they reduce the uncertainties, and so on.
Yeah, okay.
That's why it's such fun.
Yeah. And now, when we last spoke, are you thinking about a PhD? Have you started a PhD? Where are you with that?
I'm doing a part-time MA on Jung, on Carl Jung and a sort of post-Jungian thought, because I've always thought that I'm very interested in religious conflict.
Uh-huh.
And I think that understanding religious conflict from a kind of Jungian perspective is really part of it. In fact, I was starting to write about it, and I realized I didn't know enough. So, which is why I signed up for doing a 2-year MA in the subject, and I've got so completely intrigued by it. I am seriously thinking about doing, going on to do a sort of PhD, and looking actually at the whole field of mediation and mediators through a kind of Jungian lens. And I haven't quite worked out how to do this, but I will doubtly be reading, listening to all your interviews and trying to discern how to actually approach the subject. And that's really just to try and deepen the understanding of what it is that third parties, that mediators actually do, which deals with the human elements of conflict. That's the nub of it. How do we actually bring sort of the depth psychology into more of the role, or at least to understand what the role means to us as individual practitioners.
Yeah. Why are you so interested by religious conflict? What is it about that sort of conflict that captures your attention?
Because I think in many ways religion, and by religion also, of course, I mean atheism, which is a curious form of religion, I think goes to the heart of who we are as individuals. Not only beliefs and values, but our sense of identity. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I have tribal identity. What is it which ultimately makes us tick as thinking, conscious beings?
Okay. Listen, Andrew, you've been incredibly generous with your time. I'm aware we're almost time's almost up. If people want to find out a bit more about the work that you do, get in touch, find out about facilitator training, all of that sort of stuff, and of course, pick up some of your books. I know you've published quite extensively. Where's the best place to find you on the information superhighway?
Probably by emailing me directly. I took down my website quite recently, and I am in the process of actually putting together another. So there will be a website with all this stuff on it in due course when I get round to it. But otherwise, I'm very happy to hear from people directly. So if you put my email address in the interview notes or something, that's absolutely fine.
Okay, and you're on LinkedIn. You're on LinkedIn.
Yeah, sorry.
You're on LinkedIn.
I'm on LinkedIn as well. Absolutely. Yeah. So people can send me messages via LinkedIn, and I'm very happy to deal with individuals and whatever people want. Of course, yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Andrew, I'm going to be the first one to say a huge thank you for your time and sharing your stories and knowledge and wisdom. And I look forward to the Jungian Mediator Handbook.
Yes. Yeah, well, absolutely. We'll see where that goes. If anybody out there who's listening to this has got any thoughts on the subject, I would be really interested to hear them. Okay. I'm getting my teeth into this slowly.
Okay. And anyone watching...
but anyway, thanks very much. This has been really fun. I had no idea that we'd been talking for so long.
And if anyone watching this interview thinks about using re-engineering conflict as a title to the book, think again.
We're going to patent this, aren't we?
Yeah. We are, yes.
Copyright.
Copyrighted. Andrew Acland, thank you very much.
Thanks, Alan.